Take a stroll down the avenues of Miami, Florida, back in the mid-1970s, and you would have witnessed a bizarre trend that baffled the locals, but had store owners grinning from ear to ear. The high-end boutiques, the Cadillac showrooms, and the cutting-edge electronics dealers weren't packed with American tycoons, Saudi royals, or old-money Europeans. They were absolutely swarming with Venezuelans. You couldn't miss them. They were boisterous, joyful, and loaded with an insane amount of disposable income. They moved in massive packs, entire extended families of 10 or 12 sweeping through Florida shopping centers like a conquering army on a spree. The Sunshine State merchants even had a special code name for them, the Dame Dos crowd. Translated, it simply means, give me two. Because when a Venezuelan spotted a nice pair of Italian loafers, he didn't just grab one. He'd say, give me two, one for me, one for my buddy. Buying a color TV, the absolute peak of technology back then, give me two. I need one for the living room and another for the bathroom. And they never used credit. It was always cold, hard cash. They hauled around suitcases stuffed with crisp United States dollars that still smelled like bank vaults in Caracas. They snatched up condos in Brickell and mansions in Coral Gables without even glancing at the price tag. They were dropping $100 bills as tips for waiters. To the average American, who was getting crushed by the recession and inflation of the Carter era, these folks looked like aliens from a planet made of pure gold. Meanwhile, back in Caracas, the skyline was morphing so fast the rest of the world couldn't keep up. It was a forest of construction cranes and neon signs, a concrete jungle expanding faster than anything else in the hemisphere. It was the only spot in South America where the Concorde, that supersonic jet for the global elite, touched down on a schedule. You could literally hop on a flight in Paris and touch down in Caracas 3 hours later, just in time for a champagne lunch at a French bistro in Altamira, dining on lobster that had been flown in from Maine that very morning. Shops in the Sabana Grande district were stocking the latest couture from Milan and Paris, weeks before that merchandise even hit the racks in New York or London. Venezuela had the highest per-person whiskey consumption on the planet. They were knocking back 18-year-old scotch like it was tap water. It was a fiesta that felt like it would go on forever. This was the golden age of Saudi Venezuela. To really grasp this moment of sheer madness, this fever dream of endless spending, you have to look past the glitz. The world looked at Venezuela and thought they were seeing a miracle. They saw a South American powerhouse that had cracked the code to success, a stable democracy where power transferred peacefully every 5 years like clockwork, a booming middle class with their own cars and suburban homes, and beneath it, all oil rivers of it, oceans of it. But that miracle was actually a trap. It was a gilded cage, constructed bar by the global financial machine. And the people inside that cage were too intoxicated by cheap gas and expensive liquor to realize someone was locking the door. The origin of this era starts thousands of miles away in the burning sands of the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted. The Arab oil nations, enraged by Western support for Israel, slammed the brakes on production. They turned off the spigot. Oil prices didn't just creep up, they detonated. The cost quadrupled almost overnight. It jumped from $3 a barrel to $12 in a heartbeat. It was the single largest transfer of wealth the human race had ever seen. Cash flooded out of the industrial giants like the United States and Europe and crashed like a tidal wave into the treasuries of OPEC nations. And remember, Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC. In fact, the whole concept of OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, was largely the brainchild of a Venezuelan visionary named Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. He was a brilliant but strict man who drove a tiny car and read by candlelight to save a few cents on electricity. Years prior, he had warned his people that oil was the devil's excrement. He preached that it brought misery, waste, and corruption. He predicted that a sudden flood of unearned riches would rot the nation's soul from the inside out. But in 1974, nobody wanted to hear the doom and gloom of a grumpy old man. They were too busy listening to the music of ringing cash registers. The man sitting in the Venezuelan presidency at that time was Carlos Andrés Pérez, known to the masses simply as Cap. He was a high-energy populist full of charisma, walking fast, talking faster, and rocking loud plaid sport coats. He took the helm in 1974, right as that tsunami of petrodollars crashed onto the shore. He found himself in a predicament no leader in history had ever dealt with. He had too much money. The treasury was literally overflowing. The central bank ran out of vault space for their international reserves. They were reduced to stacking sacks of cash in the corridors of the Ministry of Finance. Carlos Andrés Pérez announced that Venezuela would use this windfall to become a first world superpower within 10 years. He coined the slogan, La Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. His blueprint was bold. He planned to nationalize the oil industry, which was still operated by American giants like Exxon and Shell. He wanted to carve a massive steel industry out of the jungle to rival Pittsburgh. He wanted to construct the largest hydroelectric dam on Earth. He wanted to hand a full scholarship to every single student who dreamed of studying overseas. He wanted to transform Venezuela into an industrial titan that would drag Latin America into the 21st century. And for a hot minute, it looked like it was working. The government rolled out the Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho scholarship program. Tens of thousands of young Venezuelans were shipped off to the most prestigious universities in the States and Europe, with the government picking up the entire tab. You had the sons and daughters of mechanics and housekeepers studying at Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. It was a noble ambition, a massive investment in human capital meant to secure the future. But behind the curtain, the economy was decaying. This is a classic case of what economists call Dutch disease. When a nation gets hit with a massive injection of foreign cash, like oil dollars, it drives the value of the local currency through the roof. The Venezuelan bolivar was pegged to the dollar at 4.30. It was solid as a rock. You could walk into any bank in Caracas with bolivars and walk out with dollars, no questions asked. But because the currency was so strong, importing goods became incredibly cheap, while producing anything locally became impossibly expensive. Why would a Venezuelan farmer bother growing corn when he could buy it from Iowa for half the cost? Why would a factory in Valencia manufacture shoes when you could import designer Italian pairs for pennies? The country's ability to produce anything vanished. Agriculture collapsed. Fields lay fallow. Farmers abandoned their land and flooded into the cities, ending up in shanty towns, surviving on government handouts. Venezuela quit the production game entirely and pivoted to full-time consumption. Every single commodity had to be shipped in right down to the eggs on the breakfast table. Clothing automobiles, you name it. They literally flew in sand to mix concrete for their high-rises because apparently domestic Venezuelan sand just didn't cut it. This reliance on foreign goods was just the bait. The hook and the far deadlier trap was the credit. It seems insane that a nation drowning in revenue would need a loan. But that is the great riddle of the 1970s. All that petrocash flooding into Caracas, Riyadh, and Tehran needed a home. The oil giants couldn't spend the cash as fast as they earned it, so they parked it in the vaults of London and Wall Street, Citibank, Chase, Manhattan, Bank of America. Suddenly, these financial institutions were sitting on Everest-sized piles of liquidity deposited by the petrol states. But for a bank, stagnant vaults are a nightmare. You don't profit by hoarding cash. You profit by lending it out. They were desperate to offload billions of dollars. The problem was the United States economy was tanking. Domestic businesses were tightening their belts, not taking out loans. So the financiers turned their gaze southward. They zeroed in on Latin America, specifically Venezuela. Here was a stable democracy, sitting on the biggest crude reserves in the hemisphere. It looked like a risk-free bet. Executives hopped on the Concorde in New York and touched down in Caracas, ready to deal. They set up shop in the Tamanaco Hotel, sipping top-shelf scotch with ministers' briefcases stuffed with contracts. They didn't wait for Venezuela to ask for funds. They practically forced the money into their hands. It was a seductive pitch. Oil prices are on an infinite upward trajectory, they promised. Crude is $12 today, but it'll be $20.50, $100 tomorrow. Borrow $1 billion now, and inflation plus oil revenue will wipe that debt clean. It's basically free capital, pure leverage. President Carlos Andrés Pérez and his administration swallowed the bait whole. The borrowing spree began in earnest. They took out loans to plug the gaps in massive infrastructure projects that were bleeding money. They leveraged the future to subsidize imports, ensuring the public could keep buying cheap whiskey and color TVs. They borrowed to hide the massive theft draining the treasury. And the graft was spectacular. When you push that much capital through a pipeline with zero oversight, a lot of it sticks to people's fingers. Lucrative contracts went to party loyalists. Shell corporations were created solely to accept loans that would vanish into thin air. Every barrel sold and every ton of steel purchased came with a kickback. This birthed the 12 Apostles, a dozen tycoons who reached billionaire status just by being in the president's orbit. They erected mansions in the capital and snatched up private islands across the Caribbean. But the poison pill was in the fine print. The bankers weren't stupid. They knew the boom might bust. So they structured the loans with floating interest rates. Venezuela's payments weren't locked in. They were tethered to the U.S. prime rate or the London interbank rate. If the cost of borrowing rose in New York, Caracas would bleed. Amazingly, nobody in the government seemed to flag this risk. In the mid-70s, money was cheap, and the fiesta raged on. They constructed the Guri Dam, an engineering titan that electrified the entire nation. They unveiled the Caracas Metro, a pristine subway network that put the grimy New York transit system to shame. They carved the massive Ciudad Guayana industrial zone out of the jungle. In 1976, they nationalized the sector, birthing PDVSA, the state energy giant. Hoisting the flag over the derricks was meant to symbolize total economic freedom. In reality, it was a hollow victory. By the decade's end, Venezuela carried the heaviest debt load per person on Earth. They owed billions to the exact same banks holding their savings. It was a financial Ouroboros. They were paying interest just to access their own money. A global shell game. The national character began to warp. The old values of thrift and grit that built the country evaporated. In its place came the easy money mindset. Why hustle in the private sector? Just get on the government payroll. The bureaucracy bloated into a monster. You had operators paid to push buttons in automatic elevators. Gardeners on the payroll for parks that didn't exist. Consultants who offered no advice. The state morphed into the nation's father, mother, and sole provider. This mirage of prosperity hid a rotting core of inequality. While the middle class jetted off to Miami and the hillside slums, the ranchos watched the skyscrapers grow but felt none of the wealth. Sure, they got handouts. Gasoline was cheaper than tap water. You could fill a V8 American cruiser for the price of a piece of candy. Loaves of bread cost pennies, yet the schools were falling apart and the hospitals were collapsing. The windfall went to concrete and consumer goods, not human potential. The chasm between the country club set and the barrio residents widened by the hour. As the 70s wrapped up, the dashboard lights turned red, the market was flooded, new rigs in the North Sea and Alaska came online, shattering OPEC's stranglehold. Western nations got energy efficient and demand cratered. The price of crude stalled. Then it started to shake. In 1979, the newly elected president Luis Herrera Campins stepped up to the podium. He looked at the ledger and delivered a line that should have sent shivers down every spine. I'm inheriting a mortgaged country. He saw the red ink. He realized the math didn't work, $2 going out for every dollar coming in. But the machine was moving too fast to stop. Austerity was political suicide. The population was hooked on handouts. The gimme two mentality was hardwired into the culture. Everyone believed wealth was their birthright. So rather than hitting the brakes, the government slammed on the gas. They took out new loans just to service the interest on the old ones. A desperate game of musical chairs praying the music would never cut out. But silence was approaching fast. Over in Washington, D.C., a new sheriff had taken over the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with a cigar constantly clamped between his teeth, he was a man with a singular purpose. His goal was to strangle inflation in the U.S. economy no matter the cost. But to pull that off, he was about to make a move that would inadvertently shatter the Venezuelan dream into a million pieces. Volcker was preparing to hike interest rates to astronomical heights. As we close out Chapter 1, Venezuela is unknowingly teetering on the edge of a cliff. The year is 1979, and the Caracas nightlife is absolutely booming. Freeways are gridlocked with gas-guzzling American imports. The state is burning through cash like there's an endless supply, while bankers up in Manhattan are busy tallying record-breaking profits. Yet the snare is already set. Those variable interest rates are a grenade waiting to go off just as oil prices begin to soften. A nation that believes it has eclipsed the U.S. in wealth is about to get a harsh lesson. It's actually broke and living on borrowed time. Coming up in Part 2, we witness the collision. We'll watch the coffers run dry. We'll relive the notorious Black Friday and the civil unrest that erupted, revealing that the Saudi-Venezuela era was just a shimmering heat haze in the desert. It's 1981, and the jaws of the trap are ready to snap. Back in the States, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker pulls the trigger on a decision that will send shockwaves through the entire financial world. To crush the runaway inflation devouring the dollar, he cranks interest rates all the way up to 20%. For the U.S., it was brutal shock therapy. Painful, but essential for survival. For Venezuela, however, it was an execution order. Recall that tiny clause in the loan agreements about floating interest rates. Practically overnight, the cost to service Venezuela's mountain of foreign debt doubled, then tripled. They had borrowed billions when rates were at 5%. Now they were on the hook for 20%. Simultaneously, the bottom fell out of the energy sector. A global oil glut sent prices crashing down. It was the definition of a perfect storm. Expenditures were going through the roof just as revenue fell off a cliff. The squeeze was on. For a couple of years, the administration tried to mask the severity of the crisis. They incinerated their cash reserves in a desperate bid to prop up the currency, keeping the bolivar pegged at $4.30 to the dollar. They were desperate to keep the Saudi-Venezuela mirage alive. They wanted the middle class to keep taking shopping trips to Miami and the imported whiskey to keep pouring. But math is undefeated. The central bank was hemorrhaging hard currency. Every single day, millions flowed out of the country as jittery investors and the Venezuelan elite wired their fortunes to safe havens in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. This was capital flight on an industrial level. The very people who had feasted most during the boom, the so-called apostles of development, were the first to jump in the lifeboats, taking their billions with them. Then the bill finally came due on Friday, February 18th, 1983. It's a date burned into the collective consciousness of the nation, known simply as Viernes Negro Black Friday. That morning, the government threw in the towel. They confessed they could no longer hold the currency's value. The bolivar was devalued, and the 430 exchange rate, the bedrock of Venezuelan stability for decades, evaporated in a heartbeat. Officials rolled out a convoluted, tiered exchange system, but the truth was undeniable and savage. The currency had imploded. Picture waking up to discover your life savings essentially lost half its purchasing power while you slept. Imagine being a business owner with dollar-denominated debt that just tripled in size, or a student in London on a state scholarship, realizing your stipend check isn't coming, your cards are declined, and your landlord is kicking you out. The psychological trauma was massive. The Dame Dose era, the Give Me Two lifestyle died right there on that morning. The Concorde flights were grounded, the weekend sprees in Florida ceased. A middle class that once felt wealthy and untouchable was suddenly exposed and impoverished. The lights had been flipped on at the end of a rager, revealing a trashed house filled with shattered glass and stack of overdue notices. The hangover had set in, but the financial collapse was merely the opening act of the tragedy. The 1980s became known across Latin America as the Lost Decade. For Venezuela, it was a long, agonizing descent into destitution. The state was insolvent. International lenders slammed the door shut because they knew the country didn't have a prayer of paying them back. In a cruel twist, the banks themselves transformed into the villains of the story. The very same American institutions that had practically shoved loans down Venezuela's throat in the 70s were now ruthlessly demanding repayment. They deployed squads of lawyers and bean counters to Caracas. They insisted on slashing social programs. They demanded subsidies be gutted. They ordered the liquidation of state-owned assets. They didn't give a damn about the suffering of the Venezuelan populace. Their only obsession was the solvency of their own ledgers. The grinning bankers handing out cash were replaced by stone-faced auditors wielding calculators. The government tried to negotiate refinancing the debt over and over, but every new deal came with strings attached, and every stipulation translated to more misery for the average person on the street. The infrastructure built during the Golden Age started to rot. Potholes capable of swallowing sedans opened up on the highways. Hospitals ran out of basic drugs, and machines sat broken. Schools crumbled into ruin. The grandeur of Venezuela was disintegrating in real time. By 1988, the vibe was pure desperation. The man who had presided over the bonanza, Carlos Andrés Pérez, threw his hat in the ring for the presidency again. His entire campaign was a nostalgia trip, reminding voters of the glory days. He vowed to bring back the good times, dancing on podiums and waving to the crowds. A populace starving for hope bought it hook, line, and sinker, electing him in a landslide. They operated on the magical belief that his mere presence in the palace would spike oil prices and bring the dollars flooding back. They thought he was a wizard. But when Cap took the oath in 1989, he opened the vault and found only cobwebs. The money was gone. International reserves were effectively zero. His hands were tied. Was forced to go to the lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF put a bailout on the table, a loan of $4.5 billion to stop the bleeding. However, the IMF isn't a charity organization. They demanded a brutal structural adjustment program in return. It was dubbed El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn. The deal required the state to uncap prices on consumer goods, privatize government industries, and most volatile of all, eliminate the gasoline subsidy. For Venezuelans, dirt cheap gas was seen as a God-given right. It was the one tangible dividend they received for being citizens of an oil-rich land. Touching fuel subsidies wasn't just risky, it was political suicide, the ultimate third rail. But Carlos Andrés Pérez, cornered by aggressive lenders and a mountain of debt, signed the deal anyway. He took to the airwaves, looking into the camera, to tell a desperate nation that tightening their belts was the only way forward for the country. The shock therapy hit on February 27, 1989. Gas prices spiked instantly, and naturally public transit followed suit. Drivers hiked their rates overnight. Workers in the satellite towns surrounding Caracas stepped out that morning, ready for the grind, only to realize their pockets were too empty to even get on the bus. It began as a murmur in Guarinas. Shouting matches turned into burning tires, and within hours, that friction sparked an inferno. The public's frustration didn't just leak out, it detonated. The chaos spilled into the capital. Residents streamed down from the hillside slums, flooding the city center. This wasn't an organized political march. It was an all-out uprising. History remembers it as the Caracazo. For 3 days, Caracas was a war zone. Supermarkets, electronics shops, and glittery malls were stripped bare. Crowds weren't just stealing. They were reclaiming what they believed was theirs. They smashed and grabbed the very symbols of that Saudi Venezuela lifestyle that had priced them out of existence. You saw people hauling sides of beef and heavy television sets on their spines. It was the raw fury of a generation promised heaven, only to be delivered into hell. The administration froze. Local law enforcement collapsed under the weight of the mob. Pérez, once the populist darling, turned authoritarian, suspending constitutional protections in a heartbeat. He deployed the military with a single, chilling directive shoot to kill. The crackdown was savage. Soldiers sprayed automatic fire into dense crowds and indiscriminately riddled the shanty towns with bullets. They fired without hesitation. The government claimed only about 300 people died, but human rights groups suggest the real number of lives extinguished ran into the thousands. Bodies were dumped in unmarked pits. That violence severed the trust between the electorate and their democracy, forever shattering the credibility of the established political class. The myth of Venezuelan exceptionalism died on those streets. The glittering mirage of the 70s had paved a direct road to the slaughter of the 80s. That oil money turned out to be a golden cage. By borrowing against tomorrow's earnings, the nation had effectively pawned its own stability. American banks won on both ends. They cashed in on massive origination fees during the boom, then got bailed out by IMF austerity packages that strangled ordinary Venezuelans to cover the interest during the bust. The mental trauma from that period is impossible to exaggerate. It bred a toxic hatred toward the United States and free market capitalism. Citizens felt scammed, convinced their national treasure was pilfered by a cabal of foreign financiers and crooked local oligarchs. They stared at the rotting steel beams of abandoned skyscrapers and saw them for what they were, monuments to grand larceny. To them, every politician was a liar. In this landscape of wreckage and fury, a young paratrooper named Hugo Chávez spotted his chance. 3 years after the riots in 1992, he staged a coup. While his tanks failed to take the palace, his message conquered the public imagination. He declared the entire system diseased. He insisted the black gold belonged to the people. He brilliantly weaponized their longing for the good times and their rage at the betrayal. His rhetoric transcended standard politics. It addressed the shattered social contract of the bonanza years. The Saudi era had taught a harsh lesson. Cash is not the same thing as wealth. True wealth comes from productivity, education, and solid institutions. Venezuela was swimming in currency, but lacked the infrastructure to actually manage it. It was a textbook case of the resource curse. Because the state lived on oil revenue rather than tax dollars, it didn't need to listen to its citizens to survive. Its only constituents were global oil markets and foreign lenders. Once those cash flows dried up, the government didn't just stumble, it disintegrated. The tragedy of the Dame Dos generation is that they believed they were building a superpower when in reality they were blowing their inheritance on a massive fiesta. That party ended in a hangover that has pounded for 40 years. Walk through Caracas today and the ghosts of that era are everywhere. You see the space-age concrete of the 70s now stained and cracking. Unfinished towers stand like concrete tombstones over the skyline. In the minds of the elderly, you'll still find fading memories of the Concorde touching down at Maiquetía Airport, and a currency so strong it was the envy of the hemisphere. But the nostalgia is poisonous because they realize it was all an illusion, a lifestyle financed by a loan taken out in their children's names. Those interest payments are still being extracted today, paid in the currency of poverty, mass migration, and the collapse of a nation that once dared to dream of greatness. The bankers recovered their principal. The politicians pocketed their bribes, but the ordinary people, they got stuck with the tab. And that tab cost them everything. The saga of Saudi Venezuela is a modern Icarus tale flying too high on wings of crude oil and debt, only to crash violently into the sea. I'm John, and you're watching Cinematic History Tales. Hit that subscribe button to stay informed, because when the history of this century is finally written, you'll want to be one of the few who actually understood it.